Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping away from the theoretical and diving straight into a cinematic, incredibly tense look at one of the most dangerous moments in human history. We're going to explore the 13 days where humanity stood right on the very edge of the abyss, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I want you to imagine the sheer gravity of this moment, because the stakes, quite literally, could not have been higher.
Picture this. It's October 27, 1962. We are somewhere deep beneath the dark waters of the Caribbean Sea inside a Soviet submarine known as the B-59. The temperature inside is absolutely suffocating. The crew is utterly exhausted. They've been submerged for hours, completely cut off from Moscow, flying blind in the dark. Suddenly, American warships start dropping explosives into the water right on top of them. The Soviet crew has no idea what's happening on the surface. What if they believed World War III had already started? What if a single decision made inside the submarine had started a nuclear war? To understand how the world reached this heart-stopping moment, we have to go back.
Chapter 1: 90 miles from Florida. This story didn't begin in the suffocating crush of a submarine. It began with a revolution that rapidly escalated global tensions. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution takes control of Cuba. Now, Cuba is extremely close to the US, only about 90 miles from the coast of Florida. During the height of the Cold War, that proximity is terrifying for Washington. By April 1961, the United States backs the Bay of Pigs invasion to try and remove Castro, but it's a massive failure. And that failure pushes Cuba even closer into the arms of Moscow. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev looks at the geopolitical chessboard and sees a major opportunity. You might be wondering, why would the Soviet Union put nuclear missiles in Cuba? Well, the US already had nuclear Jupiter missiles positioned right on the Soviet border in Turkey. Khrushchev's logic was dangerously simple. If America can put nuclear missiles right next to the Soviet Union, why can't the Soviet Union put them right next to America?
Chapter 2: The Photographs.
So how did America discover them? This brings us to a moment of undeniable discovery, a moment of absolute shock that would practically paralyze Washington. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 aircraft flying high over Cuba takes hundreds of reconnaissance photographs. At first glance, you just see dirt roads and fields. But when American intelligence analysts look closer, they spot something horrifying. They identify the specific construction patterns and equipment used for Soviet nuclear-capable missile sites. These aren't just ordinary defensive weapons. These are missiles that could strike major targets across much of the United States in minutes. On October 16th, President John F. Kennedy is briefed, officially triggering a terrifying 13-day countdown. Now, why didn't Kennedy immediately attack? He knows he can't simply strike without risking a massive Soviet retaliation that would instantly spark a global war. So he gathers his closest advisors, forming a group known as the XCOM to figure out a way out of this nightmare.
The XCOM debated three incredibly dangerous options. Option 1 was a surprise airstrike to wipe out the sites. Option 2 was a full-scale military invasion of Cuba. Option 3, which Kennedy ultimately leaned toward, was a naval quarantine, essentially blocking Soviet ships from reaching Cuba. But make no mistake, even a quarantine was a total powder keg. Just imagine an American warship ordering a Soviet vessel to stop in the open ocean. What would happen if the Soviet ships refused to stop? What if someone panics and fires? A single bullet in the Caribbean could trigger an unstoppable nuclear chain reaction. On October 22nd, Kennedy takes the unprecedented step of addressing the American public directly on television. He draws a firm line in the sand, staring down the camera and stating that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as a direct attack by the Soviet Union on the United States. He announces the naval quarantine, shifting the immense global pressure entirely onto the shoulders of Nikita Khrushchev. America was watching, the world was watching, and they were absolutely not going to accept these missiles. Chapter 3: The World Holds Its Breath. As Khrushchev initially rejected the American position, claiming the weapons were purely defensive, everyday families across the US suddenly found themselves preparing for the literal end of the world. They were staring down the barrel of a nuclear exchange. Meanwhile, the XCOM faced an agonizing paradox. Yes, some Soviet ships approaching the quarantine line actually began to slow down or turn around, which avoided an immediate naval confrontation. But intelligence showed that the missile sites already inside Cuba were still actively being constructed. Every single day that passed gave the Soviets more time to make those weapons fully operational. So the terrifying question echoing through the White House was, if the missiles are becoming ready, does waiting for diplomacy to work actually force our hand and make war more likely? Was Khrushchev actually preparing for war? Chapter 4: Black Saturday. October 27th is universally remembered as the single most dangerous day of the entire Cold War.
It became known as Black Saturday, defined by profound confusion inside the ExComm. Kennedy receives two completely different messages from Khrushchev on back-to-back days. The October 26 message offers a potential way out. The Soviets will remove the missiles if the U.S. publicly pledges not to invade Cuba. But then, on Black Saturday, a new, much tougher message arrives, demanding the U.S. also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy's advisors are deeply divided. Which message is the real Soviet position? If Kennedy accepts everything, does America look weak? If he rejects it, do we go to war? And more importantly, what did American intelligence still not know? As if that diplomatic tension wasn't enough, on that exact same day, an American U-2 aircraft is shot out of the sky over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., is killed. American blood has now been spilled. The military pressure on Kennedy to retaliate immediately is absolutely enormous. Yet somehow, Kennedy holds off on an attack. Instead, his brother, Robert Kennedy, desperately seeks a secret, back-channel diplomatic solution with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. He delivers a blunt warning: time has essentially run out.
Chapter 5: The Submarine Climax.
While Washington and Moscow are desperately negotiating, what was happening inside those Soviet submarines? Let's pull back beneath the surface of the Caribbean Sea. There are 4 Soviet submarines in the region. One of them is the B-59, the sub we talked about earlier. It is trapped beneath the ocean. The conditions inside are horrific. It is boiling hot, the crew is dangerously exhausted, and most critically, they have extremely limited contact with their commanders in Moscow. They are flying blind in the middle of the greatest global crisis in history.
Above them, American naval forces are trying to force the submarine to surface for identification by dropping signaling depth charges. But the exhausted men inside a metal tube deep underwater don't know these are just warning signals. Explosions are violently rocking their hull. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, firmly believes they are under lethal attack. Cut off from the outside world, he concludes the absolute worst. World War III has already begun above them.
Believing the war has started, the captain makes a fateful decision. He prepares to launch their secret weapon, a nuclear torpedo. He and the political officer both agree to fire. But Soviet protocol requires the consensus of 3 senior officers to authorize a nuclear launch. The third man is Vasily Arkhipov. And Arkhipov refuses. He argues they must surface first to find out what is actually happening in the world. His miraculous, world-saving decision stops the launch. A single man's judgment prevented what would have certainly been a global nuclear catastrophe.
Chapter 6: The Secret Deal.
Thankfully, the B-59 surfaced without firing a single weapon. And the very next day, October 28th, Radio Moscow announced a resolution. But was the world really saved just by public diplomacy? What the public was told that day was only half the truth. The public deal stated that the USSR would remove its missiles from Cuba and the US would publicly pledge not to invade the island. But the secret deal, hammered out behind closed doors, was that the US quietly agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy deliberately hid this massive concession from the public because he simply couldn't afford to look weak on the global stage by trading away Allied defenses under Soviet pressure.
So what is the ultimate takeaway here? It's human judgment. History wasn't saved by a perfectly controlled political chess match between Kennedy and Khrushchev. It was saved by a messy, chaotic chain of unpredictable decisions made by flawed human beings under unimaginable pressure. It was the pilots, the sailors, and men like Vasily Arkhipov deep underwater who simply chose not to pull the trigger.
The 13 days. As we wrap up, I want you to look at the breathtaking, irreversible speed at which this all unfolded. October 16th, Kennedy learns of the missiles. By the 22nd, America is told. On the 24th, the quarantine begins. By the 27th, it's Black Saturday. An American pilot is dead and a nuclear torpedo is just minutes away from being launched. And just one day later, on the 28th, an agreement is reached. The people living through these 13 days did not have the benefit of hindsight. When they went to sleep on October 27th, they truly didn't know if they would survive to see the end of the week.
Which leaves us with a lingering, haunting thought to end on. If the difference between total nuclear annihilation and peace came down to incomplete information, blind luck, and a few individuals making the exact right decision at the exact right moment, how many times has humanity come this close to catastrophe without even realizing it? And what happens when someday they don't make the right choice? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.